I was doing basic training and then service in a army base near Nablus, and just being around there in the base, walking through Palestinian towns, having children look at you with hatred, you get this sense that you are a dominator, that you are dominating this other people, and they hate you because you're dominating them, you're controlling their lives. And in a certain sense, if there was a moment that was a break in my own sign of Zionism, it was that moment. The book is basically trying to decouple the nation state of Israel from Zionism as an ideology. And I asked whether, in fact, Zionism has done its work. I don't think that Zionism provides the real template for that kind of coexistence that is necessary, because the Jews are not going anywhere, the Palestinians are not going anywhere. And I think this is something that's extremely important today when we're looking at the student protests, when we're looking at the pro-Palestinian movement or the Palestinian solidarity movement, where we're kind of making the claim that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, is what Jonathan Greenblatt said, JADL. I think these are incredibly irresponsible remarks.
To a lot of people, to be anti-Zionist is to endorse genocide of Jews. I'm talking to Shaul Magid. He is a distinguished fellow in Jewish studies at Dartmouth College and visiting professor of modern Judaism at Harvard University, as well as a senior research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. He recently published the book, The Necessity of Exile, Essays from a Distance, which I'm very excited to talk about today. So Shaul Magid, thank you so much for giving me your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Just, I mentioned this to you before we hit record. On a personal level, what's weighing heavy on my mind is the news that's coming out of Gaza, and that's something that on a personal existential level, as someone who has been in the modern Orthodox Zionist world his whole life and went to Zionist schools, it's something that just weighs on me. I guess, yeah, to sort of frame this conversation, how do you think about what's going on in Israel today?
What's going on in Israel today is horrible and horrifying, and with everybody that's, I'm sure, listening to this, I wish and pray for the safety of all that are there. It's on the one hand shocking, certainly shocking, and yet on the other hand, if I could say, I wouldn't say. There was nothing to say about it being predictable, but I think that the situation in Israel with the both in the West Bank and Gaza, from my standpoint, was, and not only my standpoint, but certainly my standpoint, was untenable, and in a certain sense, something was going to break at some point, and no one could have expected what happened on October 7th for sure. But on the other hand, the realities on the ground did not really speak to anything that was going to be able to continue, indefinitely. I suppose the question is, for us now that we're already in January, the war is going to end at some point. Whether it's soon or later, we don't know. But I suppose the question that some of us are asking, many of us are probably asking, is, what happens when the war does end? In what way will reality change? In what way will the situation change? In what way will the paradigm change? Will the protests start up again? What does that really actually mean? So I think that I sit with everyone and think about not only the safety of the people that are there, but also in what way will October 7th change the realities in Israel? And I don't think anybody knows that at this point.
Yeah. I understood your book. I read your book as sort of being the end, sort of describing the end, the death of a certain liberal Zionism, and a liberal Zionism that I very much grew up in and I believed in and I supported. Um, and you give lots of examples of sort of why that's no longer tenable. And I think to me the sort of the response to October 7th was probably the final clarification of that point. But is that a fair characterization of some of what's going on in the book?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't articulate it as the death of liberal Zionism. I think it is I speak about the obsolescence of liberal Zionism to say two things about it. One, that I don't really see it as being a viable alternative for life in Israel Palestine. And second, I think that there is in some sense, many of people that identify as being liberal Zionists and that are unhappy in terms of what's going on with the government, what's going on with the settlers, what's going on with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, what's going on with the judicial reforms, and would like to kind of get back to some liberal Zionist status quo. And my argument in the book is that I don't really think that liberal Zionist status quo ever existed for any length of time. I mean, there were certainly certain periods where the liberal Zionist narrative seemed to be operative, but I think they were far and few between. And I'll also say that I think that liberal Zionism is an American phenomenon. I don't think liberal Zionism really exists in Israel. There is a left in Israel, or there was a left. There isn't much of a left anymore, but there is a left in Israel, but that left in Israel is not really liberal Zionism. In many ways, it's far to the left of liberal Zionism. So I think, liberal Zionism is an American phenomenon. It kind of begins with Louis Brandeis, who makes the famous argument that to be a good American is to be a Zionist, that a liberal American values and liberal values in Zionism, of course, he lived before the state of Israel, are fairly commensurate with each other. So I think it is an American reality. It's an American phenomenon. It perhaps had its institutional moment in the founding of J Street during the Obama administration. But I just don't think it's a viable way to think about how life can continue to exist in the state of Israel at this point.
Okay. Yeah. I want to come back to this more. I want to sort of flesh out what we mean by liberal Zionism and sort of what we mean by why it's sort of fallen into obsolescence. But before we come back to that, even if we just take a step back, maybe sort of like a sort of a foundational kind of question. How do you think about the relationship between Judaism and the land of Israel? I mean, I was raised with sort of Israel being very central to Judaism. Of course, there becomes a mixture, a complex question about the relation between the land of Israel and the state of Israel, and that takes many different forms. But I'm curious, just in the sort of the most open-ended question kind of way, how you think about that relationship.
I think about the relationship in the following way, and I do talk about this in the book too. Judaism as we know it, when we speak about Judaism, we're speaking about something that exists within the world that we live in. Judaism as we know it was a religion that was founded in exile. And it certainly had the land of Israel very much in mind, and the second temple and the first temple and the prophets and so on and so forth. But it's a religion that is diasporic. The very nature of it is diasporic, and you can see that in various kind of Talmudic discussions about Yavne, whether they're historically accurate or not. So I think that in a certain sense, Israel is a diasporic religion. I'm sorry, Judaism is a diasporic religion that has the land of Israel as the kind of ultimate culmination of its aspirations. And I think that in a certain sense, that had existed throughout time. I mean, for many of the centuries, many Jews didn't go to the land of Israel. Even when they were able to go to the land of Israel, they didn't. Some did, obviously. Now, Zionism is something that is much, much more recent. It's newer. From my perspective, Zionism is an articulation of Western European nationalism for Jews. I mean, there are people that'll make the case that Zionism is itself goes back to the Bible or whatever. I don't really agree with that. I think the land of Israel and the sanctity of the land of Israel and Zionism as a project of Jewish self-determination that emerges in the wake of the failure of the emancipation to solve the Jewish question is a different phenomenon. But of course, what ends up happening over the course of time, the success of Zionism, specifically with the establishment of the state, meant that, in a sense, the land of Israel and the state of Israel somehow become fused. And I that's not something that I particularly feel connected with. Not that I'm not connected in some sense to the state, but I don't really believe that the land of Israel and the state of Israel are identical. And I think making them identical is, to my mind, problematic. So I'm of the opinion that Zionism is a modern phenomenon of Jewish self-determination to solve a particular problem in Europe. And to some degree, it solved that problem, and to another degree, it didn't solve that problem. But I think in the relation to your question about the relationship between the land of Israel and Judaism, obviously, the land of Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people. I don't really think that's a contestable claim. The relationship between the homeland of the Jewish people and the nation state, the modern secular nation state of Israel, is a more complicated story, in my view.
Yeah. Again, as I've said to you, I've said on this channel in different ways, and it means different things to different people, I guess. But growing up in this modern Orthodox Jewish world, I feel like Zionism was so incredibly important that it's like hard to even believe or explain, how central it was to religion, and just one example of that, just one manifestation, is like we're taught to love Jews and to really see the best in Jews and talk well of other Jews, except for like the anti-Zionist Jews, like those are really seen as outsiders in my kind of religious world. And I don't know, can you speak to sort of the way in which it became such a tenet of religious faith, the modern state?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I can speak about it really from an American context, because Israel, of course, is a different situation because that's the nation state that people live in. But I think that there was probably in the beginning of the 1970s a very definite educational project of what I call elsewhere the Zionization of American Jewry, where where Zionism becomes, in a certain sense, not only the companion to, but the basic frame around which Judaism is understood. I think it's important to remember that there's an entire history of anti-Zionism. We're not talking about Satmar Hasidim or the ultra-Orthodox Jews, or the fact that most Orthodox Jews before the war were anti-Zionist for a variety of reasons. But within the American context, there was a very strong movement against Zionism that was in some ways dominant until the 1930s or the 1940s. And that particular history has been almost totally erased from the story of American Jewry. Now, there's a reason why that is, I suppose. And interestingly, I counted, for example, recently in a review I was writing, 10 books in English that were published in the last 2 years that were either about anti-Zionism or challenging or critical of Zionism. 10 books in the last 2 years. So obviously something is changing. But I do think that, and we can speak to that change, but I do think that you're right, that certainly within modern Orthodoxy, and it's kind of interesting how that's happened, the Zionism has become, in a sense, the frame around which Judaism is understood. Now, if you go back to the 1960s, for example, someone who is now considered to be the kind of titular head of modern Orthodoxy, Rabbi Soloveitchik, he was a Zionist for sure, but Zionism was not the centerpiece of his Judaism. And, he even had some ambivalence about its relationship to Judaism and Jewish practice. So I think there's something has become transformed within the modern Orthodox world over the past, let's say, 40 years, whereby there is no room anymore, as I understand it, within kind of contemporary modern orthodoxy for any position that is not, full on Zionist.
Yeah. Even if you're right, I believe you are right about Rav Soloveitchik. It just that's going to read as heresy to many people in my milieu because his book Kol Dodi Dofek is just considered such like a mandatory reading to like every high school student. This metaphor from Song of Songs about God knocking and you have to get the door, and that's of course the metaphor for returning to the
Yeah.
land of Israel.
Yeah, there's an interesting YouTube video that was going around recently of a talk that he gave. I don't know whether it was in the 70s. It probably was in the 70s, where he expressed somewhat more ambivalence about use of power and Jewish, attainment of power and how that was going to play itself out in the state. So I look, Kol Dofek, I mean, I've read, and I'm sure many of your listeners have read, and yes, it's a very powerful Zionist statement, but I still think it's different than what we're seeing now within modern Orthodoxy and Zionism.
Yeah. What I tried to gesture at with my opening ramble, and it's something that on a spiritual level I'm wrestling with is the sense of the Jewish text that I was taught of the compassionate Jew, it's in the Talmud in various places, it's in Rambam and Maimonides in various places, and this image and the way in which I think the marriage of Judaism with the power of the state of Israel, at least in my mind, and maybe this will change, and maybe this is an immature kind of narrow, silly perspective, but that just feels so shattered, and I feel very disillusioned about that.
I think that's true, and that's part of why I wrote about exile, because I think that thinking that Zionism is the solution or the end or the negation of exile, the erasure of exile from the Jewish psyche, is precisely something that has the potential to undermine that kind of merciful, compassionate attitude, which I think really comes from a certain sense of distance from power. And I think that the challenge of Zionism from a religious perspective, from a theological perspective, is really, how do you manage power and power over other people and still maintain a certain sense of compassion and empathy toward the other. Now, of course, you could look at this post October 7th, and maybe it looks a little bit different since, we were, as a people, kind of subjected to a horrific massacre. But nonetheless, I think that people that I consider to be influences on me, people like Aaron Shmuel Tamaris, back in the 1920s, were concerned and ambivalent about Zionism precisely because the acquisition of power is a very dangerous thing. And in a certain sense, to become political is an act of self-determination, but it also has a lot of serious challenges. And in my view is that I don't think that we have met those challenges in a way that's satisfactory.
Yeah, to a lot of people, to be anti-Zionist is to endorse genocide of Jews. I mean that's just sort of a kind of narrow, Hasbara oriented perspective. I think that a lot of people in my world seem to share. So
Yeah.
I want to sort of unpack that a little bit, but maybe as to get to that point, can you talk about, because you write about this very beautifully in your book, and I found these sections very affecting, your relationship with Zionism and your journey and sort of and yeah, how you evolved.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to come back to that other question because I think that's actually an important one. I think that anti-Zionism is certainly deeply misunderstood by a lot of Zionists, but we can come back to that.
Yeah.
So my situation is a little bit distinctive. I grew up as a secular Jew in America. I became a Baal Tshuva when I was 19, and then studied in Israel and in Brooklyn until I made Aliyah when I was 21, and lived there for a decade. I think the distinctive quality about my path to it is that I was not party to the Zionization project of my era, because my paternal grandparents were people of the workman's circle. They were socialists, they were Bundists, and so I went to a kind of workman's circle summer camp as a child, and we never talked about Israel. I mean, I went there from 1966 to 1974, through the 67 war, through the Yom Kippur War, and I don't remember ever talking about Israel. There was never an Israeli flag. This was a camp where we studied Yiddish, and there was a sense of kind of Yiddishkeit, but there was really it was not nationalistic at all. So I didn't grow up with that. And so in a certain way, when I came to becoming Orthodox, it wasn't from any Zionist perspective. And when I moved to Israel, it wasn't because I was a Zionist, although I would have considered myself a Zionist. But my desire to move to Israel was to live in Eretz HaKodesh, to live in the Holy Land. And I fairly quickly became part of like the Haredi world, the Haredi community, which was obviously very anti-Zionist at that point. And it just my relationship to Israel was never, in the early part of my journey, so to speak, was never really a political one. It became so as time went on, but in a certain way, I didn't have to I didn't have to kind of like unlearn a particular kind of Zionist education as a child, because I just never had it. It wasn't that it was anti-Zionist. It just Israel didn't really mean anything to my family.
Yeah. And you tell stories in the book. Maybe you can share them here about the experience of Kabbalat Shabbat, the Friday night prayer, looking out in the West Bank over the beautiful Judean hills, and I think you describe seeing a Palestinian
Yeah,
walking in the
right.
landscape. Can
Right.
you speak to that experience, which
Well,
is an experience? Yeah.
it was actually in Gaza. My then wife and I were looking to move to a settlement, and there were various settlements that we were thinking about. We went to a number of them, and one of them was Atzmona in Gaza, which was overlooking Khan Yunis at that time. And we went there, and it was really, for anyone that has been to Gaza, because we used to actually go to Gaza fairly frequently to the beach. It was to Gush Katif. It was, it's a magnificently beautiful place, and just the sand, the air, there's everything was certainly magical from somebody who came from this, the New York suburbs. And I went to daven on Kabbalat Shabbat. I went to daven on Friday night, and looking out the window of the srif of the small kind of synagogue, it was magnificent. But I happened, we were looking toward the sunset, and I happened to see a Gazan, Palestinian Gazan, who was just on a horse-drawn carriage going home from the market or whatever. And I realized that there was something that was missing in that kind of beautiful scenario. And what was missing is what, in a certain sense, the Arabs that were living there were just not part of the story. They were not part of the future. They existed there the way the flora and fauna existed there, but there was no real recognition from these people who were incredibly generous and incredibly, forthcoming, and incredibly spiritual, that there's another people there, and those people have lives, and those people have been living there. Many of them have been living there since they were, expelled from Israel in 1948, or left by their own volition, however they left. So there was a crack in my Zionism at that moment. There was a fissure that opened up that never really closed, that said to me, there's something about this project that doesn't make sense to me, given where I came from and the world that I grew up in. And I stayed with it for years after that, but that fissure never really healed. It just kind of widened over time. And it really kind of came to a breaking point when I served in the IDF in 1989 during the first Intifada. And I was a Shlav Betnik, for those of you with people who are a little older and they have kids, so they actually go to the army for a shorter period of time. And I was doing basic training and then service in an army base near Nablus. and just being around there in the base, walking through Palestinian towns, having children look at you with hatred, you get this sense that you are a dominator, that you are dominating this other people, and they hate you because you're dominating them, you're controlling their lives. And in a certain sense, if there was a moment that was a break in my own sign of Zionism, it was that moment. I think that, as I think I say in the book, I didn't lose my Zionism at a left-wing protest. I lost my Zionism in the IDF during the first Intifada. And I think that's an experience that's not, distinctive to me. Many people have it, and many people can experience that in a different way. But I felt at that point that this was just not a tenable project. You can't just rule over people indefinitely without them resisting. And this was the first Intifada, so the resistance was, in retrospect, pretty minimal. But nonetheless, what happened subsequent to that was not really a surprise to me.
Yeah. That's an important part of the book for me. I mean, I've spent so many Shabbatot, so many Kabbalat Shabbats, in the Judean hills, looking over, in the settlements and looking over Palestinian land, and I never had that realization. I never thought of it that way. The Palestinian people, I studied in yeshiva in the West Bank, and seeing the cars with the Palestinian license plates, seeing Palestinian people interrogated at checkpoints, all sorts of things. It never clicked. It never clicked. I think for me, there was just a total, I grew up, and I want to take responsibility. And I also think it's a social thing. There was a complete erasure of the Palestinian experience, a complete erasure. And as I've evolved intellectually, and I think understood more about history, and understood more about the way in which things that we now call evil transpire, it seems to me that the common factor, the core essence, that is just an erasure of another people. And I now grapple with sort of that shame to some extent, and to that regret and that guilt of of being so blind in that way to these people's humanity.
I know, and I'm sure a lot of people who are listening will, come up with a variety of reasons why that erasure is necessary, or try to, and this becomes the kind of liberal Zionist position that I have such problems with, to minimize it, or to say, well, Arabs in Israel really are able to do this or able to do that, or they're members of the Knesset or the judges in courts, and all of that is true, but nonetheless. There is a group of millions of people who are being occupied, and not only being occupied, but being dominated. And that's the price. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's a worth it price, because Jewish survival is more important. And if we have to dominate another people to ensure our survival and our safety, so be it. I hear that. I think that I probably thought that at a particular point in my life. I wonder whether, in a certain sense, from my perspective, really, what happens to Judaism? Because ultimately, for me, I'm not really a nationalist. I mean, I'm in this because I love Judaism and Torah. And nationalism never really spoke to me. So my question, I think, is what happens to a Judaism when it becomes a religion that is used as a tool of domination and power, and in a certain sense, what I'm trying to do in the book is say, can we think about the state of Israel without Zionism? And I think a lot of people probably will read the book and think that it's anti-Israel, but the book is really not anti-Israel, and I make that very clear at the beginning. The book is basically trying to decouple the nation state of Israel from Zionism as an ideology, and ask the question, Zionism was the ideology that created the conditions and the implementation and execution of what became the nation state of Israel. And I think without Zionism, it wouldn't have come to be. And I asked whether, in fact, Zionism has done its work. And we should just basically say, we have to think of another way where we as Jews can live in the land of Israel with a significant and growing minority of non-Jews that see us as as stealing their land, and how that's going to actually work. I don't think that Zionism provides the real template for that kind of coexistence that is necessary, because the Jews are not going anywhere, the Palestinians are not going anywhere, and I think that's kind of where we're going to come when the smoke clears after the war. Is these two people are still living here cheek by jowl, and if we don't figure out a way as the dominating force here, as the hegemon, if we don't figure out a way of living in of living of figure out a way of coexistence where both parties can feel like their both collective and individual aspirations are met, I think we're going to just produce another, God forbid, October 7th. I don't think we're going to produce another October 7th, but it's going to blow up in some other way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the lessons I learned from October 7th is that there's no amount of security, there's no amount of walls, there's no amount of infiltrating, Palestinian, arrests you could do in the middle of the night. There's nothing. There's nothing you could do to permanently just shut up millions of people who want, who want self-determination. It's just this vision, I think, of we'll erase the Palestinian narrative. We'll put up a wall so we never have to see them again, and we'll just forget about them. That's a fantasy, and it's a deadly fantasy. It's a fantasy
Yeah.
that will continue to blow up in our face.
I mean, a lot of people on social media have been trying to use the example of Japan and Germany to say, well, you can bomb people into submission. And, Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Germany after the defeat of the Nazis and the destruction of cities like Dresden, really brought the enemy to its knees. First of all, to use an example of Hiroshima is like completely egregious.
Yeah.
But separate from, I mean, my wife is Asian American, and her mother is from Nagasaki and was born a year after the bomb. So to even use that as an example, I think is horrific. But in any event, I think there are some really important differences. First of all, there's an ocean that separates Japan and America. And second of all, Japan never had claims of American land. So we're dealing with a very different situation when we're dealing with Hamas or we're dealing with Gaza, right? We're still going to live right next door, and those people have claims on Palestinian land, and that those claims are being denied for a variety of reasons. And so I don't see those analogies as really being at all effective. And I think you're right. I don't think you can bomb somebody into moderation.
Yeah, and analogies that speak more to me are like the analogies of Vietnam and the American presidents who just destroyed the reputation on this idea that we could bomb Vietnam, the Viet Cong, into submission. And you read books like The Best and the Brightest and by Halberstam and other books about the Vietnam War. There was this arrogance in the American elite that we'll just bomb them and they'll give up, But it never works that way, because in practice, in retrospect, we now know that every bomb we dropped radicalized the enemy, of course, like
Yes.
of course. So yeah, it's very heartrending, and
Yeah, and
and
and you can even go further. It was really, the Iraq War that created ISIS out of Al Qaeda. So it's just another. You can have many many examples. You can talk about different parts of the world where this is happening in Myanmar, in South Thailand. I don't think we can't. We're not going to bomb our way out of this situation.
yeah,
That's my view.
yeah. So we you spoke to this distinction between anti-Zionism and and Israel. So the way in which there's a vision here, there's a position being staked out, which I subscribe to, and I think a lot of my friends now at this point subscribe to, and we've come to it. I don't think we put it into words, or I don't think we often care to worry about the labels so much, or to negotiate the labels in most cases. But the sense that we believe in, like you said, there's two people who aren't going anywhere, and the goal is to protect that and to protect the people. And one of the way in which you do that is you let go of this dream of domination, and that's ultimately what it's about. And again, you write about this in the book, and I'm going to try to echo this back as faithfully as I can, because it spoke to me. The sense in which if liberal Zionism ever made sense, if liberal Zionism, are arguing to some extent that it never did, but if it was able to be believed as a project, democracy and Zionism, human rights, liberal values of freedom and Zionism, we live now after decades of settlement expansion, after a nation state law that was passed in 2018, I believe,
2018.
yeah, proclaiming Jewish hegemony in the land. And Netanyahu's judicial reform project to weaken democracy. It's just like, how much more evidence do we need that this is not actually a meaningful project, a two-state solution? This dream of a democratic Zionistic state is just not what we're getting.
I also think going back. I mean, I agree with you. I think going back to the beginning, I think one of the problems that I have with Zionism is its proprietary assumption. And the proprietary assumption is the land of Israel belongs to the Jews. So it's our land. Whether you see it as being historically, historical or theological, however you understand it. And therefore, it's our land, and the people that are not Jews who live in that land are really not, they have no right to be there. And we can allow them to be there, and we can even give them a country, perhaps. But it's all coming from the assumption of of this notion of propriety, that it's ours. And I don't think that liberal Zionism can really get beyond that, because I think that's baked into the very Zionist project. I think that's actually I don't think that it's a viable way of thinking for the future. I consider the land of Israel to be the homeland of the Jews. I consider Palestine to be the homeland of the Palestinians. So we have two people that are both making claims to a homeland. Both of those claims are legitimate. I don't consider one to be more legitimate than the other. They have to figure out a way of living within that situation where both of those homelands are acknowledged. And I really don't think that Zionism is the right ideology to do that. And I don't think liberal Zionism can be successful in doing that. So you can ask me, well, what then? And my response is, that's not really what the book is about. I mean, the book is not making an argument for the ways in the new ideological position. There are books like Omri Baum's Haifa Republic and a number of other books that do say, here's another model, whether it's a confederacy or whether it's two states or whether it's one democratic state. It really doesn't matter to me, actually. And frankly, and I know that a lot of people who are listening will not be happy with this, but I don't care whether it's called a Jewish state or not. If Jews can live there as Jews, freely as Jews, and create a Jewish culture and a Jewish society and live in a Jewish language, it doesn't make a difference to me what the state is called. Whether it's called Israel, whether it's called Israelstein, whether it's called something else, that's not for me to decide. I just think that the Jews should have a refuge where they can live safely, and that is at this point the state of Israel. But if it comes at the expense of having to expel or dominate another people, I feel like I mean, I don't know what language to use. I wouldn't use the language of Chil Hashem. I don't think it's really a desecration of the divine name, but I think it's a knife that strikes at the heart of Judaism.
Yeah. I've had similar conversations with family members, and I can put myself in that place of being on the receiving end of anger, for sort of articulating similar concepts, and the response in that anger is, you're inviting another Holocaust. 6 million Jews, and that's what they want to do to us now. And there's this invocation of the Jewish trauma. And that's very, very deeply ingrained. And we can be sympathetic. I mean, a lot of this conversation might feel unsympathetic to people who are espousing right-wing views, but I think it's important to also, be very sympathetic towards that. I mean, there is a lot of pain and suffering and trauma that's very, very deeply embedded and deeply
Right.
ingrained.
I
Um,
mean, I just want to interrupt you 1 second, because I think you're right. The trauma is real and the trauma is there. I think one way of looking at it is there are two ways of looking at the Holocaust. One is to looking at it as the standard, and the other is to looking at it as the exception. And I think that for a lot of people, the Holocaust becomes the standard, and that in fact Jews are always perpetually living in 1938. I don't, I've spent a lot of time working on the Holocaust and have written a fair amount of bit about it. And I don't see the Holocaust as the standard. I see it as the exception. It is a horrific genocidal exception. And this is not to say that there hasn't been anti-Semitism before, but the idea that the history of Judaism or the history of the Jewish people is the history of anti-Semitism, that then comes to its climax with the Holocaust. I just don't see Jewish history that way. And I'm not the only one, but I know that a lot of people do. And if you see Jewish history that way, if you see Jewish history as in a certain sense, the same as the history of anti-Semitism, then a particular kind of, I don't know what to call it, right-wing reactionary view of Zionism is, I suppose, logical. Look, I wrote a book on Meir Kahane. I mean, I spent a lot of time with that particular worldview, and that's the way he saw things. Anti-Semitism was eternal. It was not anything that could be resolved. The only thing that Jews can do to protect themselves from anti-Semitism is deterrence and management. And in a certain sense, that's the way a lot of people see the state of Israel.
Yeah. I don't know. I wonder if maybe I'm sort of stuck in a kind of a middle view where we're certainly, I don't believe like many people do that there's like a divine ordination, from heaven that, we're going to be continuously the subject of anti-Semitism as like a rule of nature. But, I think to, Hannah Arendt's understanding of anti-Semitism and the origins of totalitarianism, where there's something that seems to be unique about the positioning of Jewish people as a distributed population across the world that also has unique customs that are very ritualistic, that make them distinct, that make them look different and talk different and act different. And at this point in history, although things like this can obviously change and go up and down with history, but are doing very well economically and financially, are deeply embedded in economic systems, makes them ripe for a target. Like my Jewish conspiracy theory friends, like they point to the Freemasons. You know what I'm saying? But if you're not Jewish, then you have the Jews as like the alternative to the Freemasons. You know what I'm saying?
Right, right. Yeah, Hannah Arendt is somebody that, as you know, for having read the book, is somebody that I'm thinking with all the time. And I think she's one of the most astute political theorists, certainly among Jews in the 20th century, but I think even wider than that. And she has in the origins of totalitarianism, half of which is about totalitarianism, half of which is about anti-Semitism, and in her long essay on anti-Semitism that she wrote in the 1940s, she really pushes back very strongly against what she calls eternal anti-Semitism. She sees anti-Semitism as historically situated, and it is the product of a variety of historical phenomena that implicates the Jews and that is beyond the Jews, that creates the recurrence of this thing called Judenhass in German, or Jew hatred, or anti-Semitism. And I do follow her here. I mean, I'm not somebody who is denying anti-Semitism, but I'm somebody who is rejecting the concept that I'm rejecting the notion of its eternal nature, and that we have to see it within a historical context, and therefore can there ever be a world without anti-Semitism? Probably not, but there can be a world where anti-Semitism isn't something that threatens the Jews. And I think this is something that's extremely important today when we're looking at the student protests, when we're looking at the pro-Palestinian movement or the Palestinian Solidarity movement, where we're kind of making the claim that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, is what Jonathan Greenblatt said, JADL. I think these are incredibly irresponsible remarks to say that nobody can actually have a critique of Israel and its policies without being subject to the accusation of anti-Semitism. I mean, in a certain sense, there's something almost anti-Zionist about that, because one of the things that Zionism wanted to do was that the Jews should be a people like all other people, right? right? That was the whole notion. Liot l'kol ha'amim. That was what the dream was, that we would no longer be an abnormal people. We would be a people like everybody else. And if you're a people like everybody else, and if you state like everybody else, and you act in the way you do, you can be subject to a deep form of criticism. And that's just something that you have to deal with. But to say that if you criticize the nation state of Israel because of its, its dominance of the Palestinians or occupation or whatever you want to say, if you say that that's anti-Semitic, it almost abnormalizes the state in a certain way. It's almost in opposition to Zionism.
Yeah. And also when going back a piece, going back to something we were talking about earlier, when there's this knee-jerk invocation of genocide, this knee-jerk invocation of Jewish trauma, a part of me feels like what's going on is like what's called sometimes in like internet parlance, like telling on yourself, like what I understand about history, what I understand about evil, what I understand about atrocity is that it's traumatized people perpetuating a cycle of trauma on someone else. Like the Germans, coming out of like incredible trauma and then being evil because of that, And so I think this knee-jerk reaction to say we've been traumatized is not really the defense that some people think it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous kind of model that I think it's Misi Sare said about, or maybe it was I think it was Asari that basically said it's a kind of post-colonial notion that the persecuted really just want to become the persecutors, and in a sense, there is a way in which there's truth to that, not only in the case we're talking about, but I think in post-colonial thought in general, that in a certain way, yeah, those that are persecuted, leave their persecuted status, and what they want to do is they want to persecute those that persecuted them. And I think that in that sense, I think that Israel and the Palestinians are trapped in that model, that each one feels persecuted and responds to that persecution by wanting to become the persecutor. So, on some level, I can understand a very right-wing reactionary Zionist position that says, okay, it's a zero-sum game, so it's either us or them. So if it's going to be us or them, it's going to be us. I mean, I can sympathize with that. I don't necessarily think that that is the equation, but if you live with the notion that that is the equation, that is a zero-sum game, which I think Israelis are more and more inclined to do after October 7th, I think what you do is you come out of a situation by saying, we have to get rid of the Arabs because the Arabs are not going to agree to live with us. And then you just come back to Meir Kahane.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, again, I can only speak to myself. I can only speak to my own narrow intellectual program, but study atrocities, just study history, and you will see that same equation come up again and again. Every atrocity is predicated on this idea. It's just, we have no choice. It's us or them. And I think if you do that work, and this is my suggestion, that if you see that pattern play out through history, you become very skeptical of that thinking, and you become very cautious about applying that thinking in your own political problems.
It's very interesting because I think we're coming back to the question of anti-Zionism, which you raised. Some of the positions of anti-Zionism was basically that and this is coming both from the liberal camp and the ultra-traditional camp, that if you politicize Judaism, if you create a nation state, if you make Jews politically empowered, they will become like the other nations, but not in a good way. In other words, they will become dominators. They will become warmongers. They will become those that basically, as you said, see it as a zero-sum game. That in fact, from their position, and again, I'm talking about Reform and ultra-Orthodox, that maintaining a depoliticized status really better enables Judaism to be a light to the nations, to actually be different, to create a different model of what it is to be a collective in the world. Now, I think that that position lost most of its credibility with the Shoah. I think in a certain way, what the Shoah did was solidified Zionism as the only alternative, because I think that Jews just basically gave up believing that living in exile was what God wanted them to do. I mean, I think Zionism is based on a significant disbelief in a covenantal paradigm of um, exile, and they just said we don't want to do it anymore, and we're no longer willing to wait for the Messiah. We're just going to do it ourselves, which is totally understandable, given the historical realities that those people were living in. But I think there's a byproduct of that disbelief, even though it's been folded back into religious Zionism, that, oh no, this really is the Messianic era. But I think before the rise of cookie and religious Zionism, there were many Zionists that just said, I just want to abandon the Messianic idea. Who cares? Who needs it? Let's just actually go someplace where we can be safe. And I think that what's so fascinating about that is that so many Orthodox Jews were against Zionism precisely for that reason. And then what happened is that Orthodox Judaism conformed to that reason and made it itself messianic, or messianic without a Messiah. So I think, the emergence of the cookie paradigm, which is really the religious Zionism that is operational today. I mean, we're not talking about the religious Zionism of Reines or Herzog. We're talking about the religious Zionism of Kook, is really the result of trying to recalibrate a messianic Judaism in a political movement that to some degree was the abandonment of the messianic idea.
Yeah. I just wanted to maybe share a few verses that I think Judaism has such a powerful language around. I talked about compassion earlier, mercy, but just respecting the rights and the humanity of the stranger. The Bible is so filled with protecting the ger, the stranger, because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt, and of course in the Orthodox world, a lot of that's been sort of rolled over with Talmudic interpretation of like the stranger within the Jewish camp, but that's clearly not the meaning of those verses. And so just as we close down here, just some verses that I've been thinking about, like from Exodus, ger lo toneh velo telachatzenu ki garim hayitem eretz Mitzrayim. Don't oppress the stranger, for you were once strangers. And then skipping a bit, im anet taneh oto, if you were to oppress him, ki im tza'ak yitzak elai, if he calls out to me, if the stranger, the oppressed stranger calls out to me, shema eshma tza'akato, I'm going to hear his call. Bechara api, and I will get angry. Beharagti etchem becherev, and I will kill you. I will smite you with the sword. Ve'yune shechem amenot uvnechem yitomim, and your wives will become widows, and your children will become orphans. The whole book of Jonah is this idea of God telling Jonah to go to the Assyrians so they can repent, this non-Jewish enemy of Israel. And the subtext of that story is that when they repent, they're then going to rise up in power and conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. But and Jonah tries to escape in that mission, and God says to Jonah, these are my children, the people of Assyria, this non-Jewish nation. They're my children as well, and I care about them as much as you cared about the tree that was destroyed.
Right.
And then the last one, from Amos, God says to the Jewish people, "Halo kivnei kushim atem li bnei Israel." You're like the Kushim. Et Yisrael haliti me'eretz Mitzrayim. I took the Jewish people out of Egypt. Uplishtim mikaftur, the Philistines from Kaftur, ve'aram mikir. And the Aram nation from Kir. There's a sense in the Jewish texts, if you know where to look, it's obviously not everywhere, of a universalism, of an understanding of the human rights and the dignity of the non-Jewish nations, even our enemies. And to see that so absent in the modern religious project of Orthodoxy is so heartbreaking.
I hear you, and there are many other verses that one could quote, and Yeshayahu Leibovich was great at bringing up all these kinds of verses about precisely what you're saying. On some level, this becomes the price of the politicization of Judaism. Now, I understand how people will come and say, "Oh yeah, but they weren't talking about the enemy; they were talking about the neighbor." And the Palestinians are not neighbors; the Palestinians are enemies. That, of course, Kahana made famous many years ago. I just think that we could take all of those verses and we can sit down with a kind of, we can go to Gush Etzion and sit down in the Beit Midrash there, and the Rosh Yeshiva, the Ramim, can give all kinds of interpretations of those verses that will fit within the paradigm of the religious Zionist narrative. That's what Jews have done for thousands of years, right? We just keep reinterpreting the tradition over and over again. I do think that to some degree, what certainly the religious Zionism that has emerged in the settlements is strangely a kind of neo-biblical, post-prophetic, and almost to some degree not anti-rabbinic but rabbinic resistant tradition. And the neo-biblicism is basically a Judaism that is land-based, that is about conquest. And we can go to the book of Yehoshua and we can go to various other places. And that's the Judaism is that the religious Zionist Judaism of today. And this is not the religious Zionism of Rav Kook. I mean, Rav Kook was from a whole different world and had a whole different, historical context. But where it is today is a Judaism of a kind of zero-sum game. It's us or them. They are the enemy. This is our land. They have no right to be here, and they are our guests at best if they are willing to submit to the conditions that we offer them. I think that's where we are, and from my perspective, I think there's a lot of damage that's been done to precisely the kind of universalistic resonance of Judaism of the prophets, and that's the choice that we made, and perhaps we made it because the world forced us to make it through oppression, through persecution, through the Holocaust. But I think that there's time to it may be time to rethink that.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm pretty pessimistic. Not as a person, by the way. I'm pretty optimistic as a person. I'm pessimistic because I think that one of the things that October 7th did in the collective Jewish psyche is it embedded more deeply into that psyche that the Palestinians are only the enemy, and therefore the only way to protect ourselves is to get rid of them. And I think that we see that happening already. And if it's not getting rid of them, it's certainly subjecting them to a level of domination that will only explode in the future. So when somebody asked me at an event we did here at Harvard after the war, what's the solution? That's kind of the classic example. My response was, in the present paradigm, there really isn't a solution. The whole paradigm would have to change. And it doesn't seem like the Israeli electorate is in the mood for that. It doesn't seem like the government is in the mood for that. And it doesn't seem like world Jewry, frankly, is in the mood for that. So I think we're in for a really, a very kind of complicated, rough ride for a while until something changes. And I'm not really sure how that's going to happen. I think that one of the things that I tried to introduce in the book as one possible, beginning is to rethink the concept of exile from a negative to a positive. That exile does promote a sense of not yet, what Rosenzweig called the not yet, or humility or compassion, and that abandoning exile, and Gershom Scholem said this in his interview in the early 1970s with Muki Shur. He said that abandoning exile is a very precarious thing, and the anti-Zionists understood that much more than the Zionists did. This is Gershom Scholem, who himself was a Zionist. So I think that to rethink the category of exile is something that can be useful not only for Jews that live in the diaspora, but for Jews who live in the land of Israel, for Jews who live in the state of Israel. I have a chapter on Rav Shagar, who has an essay called Religious Post-Zionism, where he basically does say we need to actually reintroduce exile into sovereignty, or we're just going to become an ethnocentric, chauvinistic people. And I think exile is, I hope to be able to kind of, in the book, introduce the category of exile as something that could be part of that equation of rethinking what the future could be.
Yeah, Shaul Magid, I'm fearful for the blowback I'm gonna get from this post this conversation. I say that tongue in cheek, but I'm incredibly grateful for your time and for the book and for
Look,
the
I
conversation.
will just say it in closing to your listeners. I understand and sympathize with where a lot of you are coming from, but we really have to think our way out of this. We're stuck in a cycle of violence, and that's really what it is. That we're not going to be able um, to get out of through violence. And I think that's something. And by violence, by the way, I don't mean only physical violence. I mean domination. I mean occupation. And I think it's important to state that from my perspective, occupation is itself an act of violence.
Yeah,
And so we really have to think about another way. And I think we can do it.
yeah. Shaul Magid, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your book and for this wonderful conversation. I'm incredibly grateful, and I would recommend it to anyone interested in these themes and topics. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amit. I appreciate it.